All right, folks, well, we're back to the next part. This part is the diencephalon and the limbic system. So the diencephalon is the epithalamus, thalamus, and hypothalamus, and the limbic system is a decentralized or diffuse set of areas of the brain all involved in emotions and some of your basic drives. So diencephalon, you can see the circle right here. They're saying right about in here, but underneath the cerebral cortex, you pull it out, and what you pull out here is the thalamus. And you can see that there's different groups of the thalamus, and you can see all of these. And it's actually pretty easy to memorize these groups. Uh, I will tell you a couple things about the thalamus. That 90% of all sensory input goes through the thalamus, almost all of it. But the thalamus takes all of that and only sends about 1% of everything it receives onto the cerebral cortex. Now, it doesn't ignore the rest. The rest of what it receives, it processes at our subconscious level. So we're only conscious of whatever the thalamus sends to our cerebral cortex. So most of what you receive, the thalamus handles, and you're never even conscious that it's happening. And if you want some examples, right now, until I say it, you won't be aware of this. Right now, you are not aware of the clothes on your body. And okay, now you are because you're thinking about it. So what happened is, your thalamus is getting all this input that your shirt is on your back and your pants are on you, and your shoes are on you. I mean, unless something's pinching and hurting, you're not aware of this. The thalamus doesn't send that information to the cerebral cortex. It's a constant input of sensory information. Your thalamus handles it and doesn't make you aware of it. You can see that it's two nuclei we've talked about before. You can see the lateral geniculate nucleus right here, which gets visual input and sends it to the superior colliculi. You can see the middle geniculate nucleus right here, which gets auditory input and sends it to the inferior colliculi. So you can see we're starting to put things together there. You can see that this lateral group has a lot of talk with the limbic system, which we're going to talk about. You're going to say, you probably say, well, it doesn't say limbic system up there. Yeah, but the cingulate gyrus is a limbic lobe. It's a huge limbic lobe. So you can see this, that the thalamus is involved in a lot of input and a lot of output to different areas of the brain. So it's intimately involved in a lot of things. So that's the thalamus. Oh, by the way, anatomically recall that there's two lobes to the thalamus connected by the interthalamic adhesion, but they don't talk to each other. There's no neuron fibers in the interthalamic adhesion, but there's two lobes to the thalamus. All right. This is showing you what different groups do. So it's the same picture, but it has the summary. And actually, I just kind of went through a lot of it and summarized some of it for you. So this tells you what different nuclei of the thalamus does. All right. Hypothalamus. Now, underneath the thalamus is this hypothalamus. Not first and foremost, but probably what you might know already is that this whole area of the hypothalamus right here, what you're looking at right here, this whole area is the boss of this pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is the master endocrine gland. Well, if the hypothalamus is its boss, why isn't the hypothalamus the master endocrine gland? And the answer is the hypothalamus is nervous tissue. And the pituitary, at least the anterior pituitary anyway, is endocrine tissue. So the hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary. It actually stores two hormones that it itself makes in the posterior pituitary. You can see different nuclei here in the hypothalamus. You can see this preoptic area. This is your thermostat. This preoptic area right here is your thermostat. You can see this paraventricular nucleus right here. The paraventricular nucleus makes one of the two hormones that are stored in the posterior pituitary gland. The paraventricular nucleus makes oxytocin. That's stored in the posterior pituitary. All right, and told to be released by the paraventricular nucleus. So it's stored there, and it also tells the posterior pituitary when to secrete that. You're going to say, where's the other one? It's right here. This is the I call it SON, supraoptic nucleus. This makes antidiuretic hormone, also called vasopressin sometimes. So right here, the PVN, the paraventricular nucleus, and right here, the supraoptic nucleus, make the two hormones that are stored in the posterior pituitary. Both ADH and oxytocin are stored right there in the posterior pituitary and told when to be secreted. All right. Oh, the mammillary bodies right here. Here's the mammillary bodies. Now they stick off significantly enough where we call them mammillary bodies, but most of the literature considers them part of the hypothalamus. These are your feeding reflexes. The mammillary bodies are involved in your feeding reflexes. This big purple area right here, this is the actual boss of the anterior pituitary. So this tuberal nucleus sends down inhibiting factors and releasing factors, also called inhibiting hormones and releasing hormones. So the releasing hormones or releasing factors tell the posterior pituitary what to do. The inhibiting hormones or inhibiting factors tell the anterior pituitary what to do. Of course, the releasing hormones say, hey, release this. The inhibiting hormones say, hey, don't release this. So we'll talk a lot more about that in the endocrine chapter. Now, I have incessantly been telling you that the medulla oblongata does blood pressure, heart rate, and respiratory, has respiratory centers. But how does it talk to the rest of the brain? How is it involved in all of that? Like, how does it know the heart rate's too fast? How does it know it's too slow, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And the answer is autonomic neurons. So I have these autonomic centers in my hypothalamus that are involved, and one of them is right here. Here's an autonomic center, and the other one's right here. Here's an autonomic center. These two autonomic centers are talk to the medulla oblongata and help control the blood rate and the blood pressure and breathing. So those are some autonomic centers of the hypothalamus. You can see the hypothalamus does a whole heck of a lot right there, and we'll be talking about it more and more because we tie it back into the endocrine system. We tie it back into the autonomic nervous system when we do that part. But the thalamus and hypothalamus are part of the diencephalon. Here's a collage for you. The epithalamus is this pineal gland right there, and this habenula right there. That's the epithalamus. So the pineal gland and the habenula. The pineal gland makes a hormone called melatonin, which is involved in your circadian rhythms. Melatonin. So it helps to establish your circadian rhythms. And that's the epithalamus. And you can see the epithalamus again. It's here, pineal gland, and go right up here, and then underneath that. You can't see underneath that fornix now. The fornix is obscuring the habenula, in other words. All right, the limbic system, very diverse areas of the brain. First of all, you have the limbic lobe right here called the cingulate gyrus. This is the cingulate gyrus right above the corpus callosum. The cingulate gyrus is considered the limbic lobe. You have the parahippocampal gyrus right here down in my temporal lobe. That's the parahippocampal gyrus. You have the dentate gyrus right here. Right here's the dentate gyrus. Now what's inside that dentate gyrus, I'll show you in lab. Really deep into this temporal lobe. Actually sitting on the floor of the temporal lobe is this hippocampus, deep in on the floor. Hippocampus is involved in memory, and it's considered part of your limbic system. So we'll talk a lot about the hippocampus in the future when we talk about memory. Let me see. The hypothalamus is involved in your emotions and your limbic system. So the mammillary body right here and the hypothalamus right here. You remember from the thalamus slide that the anterior group is involved in your limbic system. So there's the anterior group of your thalamus. The fornix is a relay from way deep down here in your dentate gyrus. The fornix is a relay all the way up through here to your thalamus. So you can see the fornix, and of course I'll point that out in lab as well. So this is really a lot of anatomy, which we'll do in lab. So let me just tell you some physiology of the limbic system. The limbic system has everything to do with your emotions. Now, I mean, some people might think that's a hindrance, but emotions and our basic drives And by the way, our emotions have an evolutionary advantage to us getting our food and eating and living long enough to pass on our DNA. In other words, sex, passing on our DNA. I mean, and you think about it, if you weren't jealous of a mate, then you potentially would not be the only one having children with that mate, and you want to pass on your DNA. You don't want competition for that. So jealousy is an emotion that ensures that you will pass on your DNA and maybe prevent a suitor from passing on their DNA. So that's jealousy. When you are when you have anger or rages based on, say, feeding behaviors, like you protect your food. I mean, if you don't have that, then you could starve to death. And of course, if you starve to death, you can't pass on your DNA. Uh, some of the some of the positive, what we call positive emotions. I mean, emotions are just emotions. What's positive and negative is how you react to them. But what we call positive emotions, like love and these things, they could have advantages for child rearing and nurturing, because we're not the kind of organism that has 1,000 kids and ignores them and just hopes that a couple live. We have very few children, and we nurture and take care of them for years and years. So some emotions like love can be an advantage in that sense. Now, let me tell you something about the limbic system. Very primitive part of the brain, but the cerebral cortex, which is where your intellect is, the seat of the intellect is in your cerebral cortex. Matter of fact, a lot of it's up here in the prefrontal cortex. It always looks for an emotional context. When you make a decision, that cerebral cortex is sending information to your limbic system to look for emotional context. And that's where it picks up the motivation to make this decision. It has to bounce it off the limbic system to see if you're motivated enough to do it. So uh, that's where the limbic system comes into play with some of your intellect. This is a blown up picture of parts of the limbic system. You can see the amygdaloid body right here. Whoops, right there, this purple area right here. Some rage is involved. Some of your rage and anger stems from the amygdaloid body. Um, Otherwise, we've talked about the rest of this in here. Now, uh, the limbic system also feeds into the reticular formation. So what does that mean? Well, we have our reticular formation running up and down our medulla and our pons. Okay, that's the reticular formation. We have all of this input into the reticular formation, all of this sensory input. We also have limbic input into our reticular formation. And you probably have felt this before, where you had emotional energy. I mean, you could be physically wiped out and ready to sleep and tired, and then something happens and you get a burst of energy. Well, what happens is the limbic system starts having input into your reticular formation, which is what keeps you conscious and gives you this extra emotional energy. Now, what happens with the reticular formation is its receptors become less and less sensitive to the input as time goes on, and you eventually will fall asleep, of course. Even if you turn up the radio, even if you roll down your window and get cold, even if you increase your sensory input, you eventually still will fall asleep. But there's a lot of input into your into your reticular formation, even from the limbic system. And I wanted to tell you about emotional energy, and that's where you might get it from. And by the way, a lot of emotional activity makes you tired, because eventually your reticular formation will become less and less sensitive to the emotional input. So that could happen as well.